Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. So let's get started. Today, I really wanted to talk about change leadership in terms of resilience and how we communicate in a way to bring out that resilience in others. So, the artistry of change, the top 3 habits of highly resilient people. There's an old saying, before I criticize someone, I walk a mile in their shoes. That way, if they get angry, they're a mile away and barefoot. Now, obviously, how we communicate during times of intense and rapid change can make or break you in your role in HR, but can also really affect your organization. So our main theme today is this: differences are like fire. Too much causes damage to people and property, but too little and no important change can happen. So this is for you if you're looking for ways to prevent the kind of unnecessary communication breakdowns that come up when people are stressed by change, or if you want to resolve existing issues in a respectful way. Of course, breakdowns in communication are inevitable in any work or home environment, but they're especially important to resolve quickly when there's intense change and when people's safety and well-being are at risk. Now, I know we all know that, and we also know that how you approach those breakdowns and how quickly you can resolve them can have a massive effect on productivity, safety, wellness at many levels in your organization, and not just the physical. Now, of course, you may have in-depth change management and communication tools provided by your leadership, which is excellent. And sometimes, in my experience of working with many companies, big and small, all over the world, those protocols can be very complex, and as a result, people don't use them as much as they should. They're good for a complex, high-stakes situation where there is time and skill and training available to really do it properly. But sometimes you just don't have the luxury of that. You just need something that's easy to remember, easy to apply, and that will get to the core of the issue and unravel it quickly. And that's why I focus on these 3 perspectives and habits of highly resilient people who are excellent communicators to do just that. They may seem deceptively simple, but if you have a habit for applying them regularly, you can navigate rapid change issues far more effectively. Now, to start with, I wanted to let you know that what I'm sharing today is based on 12 years of surveying in 75 different companies, doing 167 programs, and these were the top takeaways. As such, I'm going to ask you in a moment to guess from one of 3 answers that you imagine our surveys discovered regarding communication in the workplace, because I'm sure you're pretty smart on this subject already, but just to get the wheels greased and get us thinking on this topic. So just type into the chat the number 1, 2, or 3 for quiz question number 1, which is the most common underlying cause of a communication breakdown is, according to our survey results, which might be similar in your situation, is 1, unmet expectations, 2, being in a reactive state, or 3, different perceptions. So for example, with unmet expectations, it's like when you expected a person to do their part of the job and they don't, like a safety check. 2, being in a reactive state is when, say, someone is using a harsh tone of voice. Or 3, different perceptions, of course, is that, say, one manager thinks their supervisor is too lenient when it comes to safety measures, and the other thinks they're not. So what do you think came first in our surveys, 1, 2, or 3? Okay, well, it was a bit of everything. Of course, it is all these things, but our interview showed it was number 2, being in a reactive state, that was the most common cause that started the whole thing off in the first place. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So let's do quiz question number 2. Just type into the chat 1, 2, or 3. The worst downside of not resolving differences of opinion at work were 1, tense atmosphere, 2, loss of productivity, or 3, stress and related health and safety issues. So say two people have a falling out that work together regularly and they don't do what it takes to resolve it. I'm sure everyone has been either in that position or watched it happen. Now, of course, it is all three of these things, but what's the worst? You know, it's number 3. It's these stress and related health and safety issues. Okay, and the third one, type into the chat 1, 2, or 3. This question is, what most often starts the process of rebuilding trust where it was lost? So type 1, validating the other person's point of view. 2, face-to-face communication. Or 3, sincere apology. So type into the chat which one of these you think is most powerful to just start the process happening. Again, it is all three of these things, but our interviews showed that the first and most important one was validating the other person's point of view, even if you disagreed with it, just putting yourself in their shoes. I can see that from your perspective, it was upsetting when I didn't arrive on time, or I didn't get that part of the job done. A small statement like that often helped the other person become untriggered, which allowed their brain capacity to dial up again. And then usually both were willing to have a face-to-face communication and sincerely apologize. So let's look at 3 perspective shifts people had to go through to move from not being very resilient and a poor communicator to highly resilient and an excellent communicator, especially those in a leadership role that came up in our research. Now, I've had all of these poor perspectives in my life, so you may or may not have. Let's see. It sort of depends on your cultural background, maybe your values, your personality, your training. So let's look at perspective shift number 1. They had to move from conflict means there's something wrong to conflict can be healthy. Now, in my family, having conflict meant there was something wrong. It meant people didn't care about each other. It was bad, it was wrong, and the people engaged in it were bad and wrong people. Now, in some families, it was totally different. For example, I had a friend who was Italian, and in her family, if there wasn't a lot of raised voices and people airing their point of view, then there was something wrong. People who care about each other engage with each other in these issues. If they didn't care about each other, that's when they stopped communicating. So it depends sometimes on your cultural background like that, or it depends on the meaning you give those conflict situations. Now, by conflict, I mean anything from you and your spouse can't agree on what color to paint the living room, all the way up to an all-out war. Now, sometimes people hear the word conflict and they think war, ugly lawsuit, but I mean the whole spectrum. Every organization, as I said, has politics, conflicts big and small, issues that stay unresolved for years, and there just tends to be a lot more conflict when there's a lot of change going on. And as I said, there aren't too many places in the world where you find this perfect harmony all the time. Now, I didn't realize that when I did my first conflict resolution course. I just decided to take it as a student, a 2-day course. Totally changed my life. I thought, oh my goodness, there's a way you can do conflict and have it be healthy? So then I did another course, another, until I'd completed a 2-year diploma in conflict resolution and international negotiation. So I was fascinated by the whole topic and have been training and coaching others on it ever since. So think about that for yourself. Do you think that conflict means there's something wrong, or do you realize that sometimes conflict can be healthy depending on how you approach it? So let's look at perspective shift number 2. They had to move from thinking external circumstances control how I feel to my thoughts control how I feel. So you often hear people say, that guy makes me so angry. But is that really true? That guy doesn't make everyone angry. It's not the external circumstance. It's your thought about it. It's like if you've ever seen two different people ride a roller coaster. One person has their arms in the air, they're laughing, they're enjoying themselves. Some people are eyes closed, feeling sick. It proves that stress is not an event. It's not the roller coaster, the external circumstance, but the person's relationship to it, the thoughts and meaning they give it. So once they made that crossover, which was huge, their communication skills went up exponentially. So think about that for yourself. And I think we all go up and down on the spectrum. We get triggered by an external circumstance. We think that's what's doing it. And then we sort of wake up to the fact that, oh, it's the way I'm thinking about it. So how quickly do you remember to change your thoughts so that you can move forward with the issue in a more constructive way? And then perspective shift number 3 was moving from, if people make mistakes or do things I don't like, they should live the rest of their life in shame, guilt, and regret. Now, I know that sounds kind of funny, but people think like that, right? And I have felt this way too. As opposed to learning from mistakes and failures and challenges, plus forgiveness equals freedom. So many of us may intellectually understand the value of that perspective shift, but might find it harder to put into practice. The neuroscience studies we've done at my company show that you actually cannot learn from past mistakes fully if you haven't looked at the situation from a place of, what is the benefit of having experienced this? How can I turn this into wisdom? Then you can usually forgive yourself and others, and then it moves out of this trauma center of the brain, which is in the middle here, and then gets stored as wisdom here in the frontal lobe of the brain, in the outer lobes. That's a huge finding. Otherwise, studies showed that people just repeated the mistake until they did those 2 steps. So if the trauma, or just the bad feelings about it, stayed stuck or unprocessed in this part of the brain, the person was more likely to repeat the mistake. Unless they did those 2 steps. Step 1, learning from the situation, and step 2, letting it go. And then it moved into the neocortex and was stored as wisdom. There's a simple example you might relate to. I went to my 10-year high school reunion. Maybe you've been to one of your high school reunions. And across the room, I saw this guy that had dumped me on prom night. So I avoided eye contact with him and I tried to not talk to him. But at the end of the night, he came up, arms outstretched, and said, "Hey, are you trying to avoid me?" And I said, "Maybe." "Why?" "Well, I think you know why." "No." "Well, you dumped me on prom night." "I dumped you? I thought you dumped me." We had to run through the whole evening and the weeks previous to realize it was all a miscommunication. And then we both went off to university right after that, and we never talked about it. And he felt sad about the whole thing, but he got over it in about a week or 2, and I held on to it for 10 years. I wanted him to live his life in shame, guilt, and regret for doing that. And he didn't. Who did it harm the most? Me, because I held on to it for 10 years. And, not consciously all the time, but subconsciously. And I think it definitely affected my relationships with the guys that I dated in my 20s. So I know it seems like a funny, silly thing now, but we don't realize the repercussions of those choices that we make. So excellent communicators were people who'd done a lot of forgiveness and resolved issues in their life. They just learned from the situation, and there was a cleanness about their way of interacting. And we have thousands of these in our life. that are unresolved, that are floating around the back of our head, right? And affect our present day communications. So let's look at habit number 1 that they had, which was they de-escalated before discussing an issue, as opposed to saying, I'm not triggered, or not aware when they are triggered. Many people are triggered and they say, no, I'm fine, when they're not. And many times we're triggered when we don't even know it. So they learned how to recognize the signs. And for me, I know I feel this sort of adrenaline rush. I feel my jaw tighten. I feel my stomach tighten. I feel myself looking at the situation from a very negative point of view. That means my survival brain is triggered. So let's talk about what I mean by that. So there's this survival brain trigger cycle, which you might be aware of. So say you get triggered, there's this trigger that happens, like someone speaks to you in a certain tone of voice that you don't like, or someone cuts you off in traffic. As you escalate, your quality of judgment goes down, and your quality of judgment will not come back up until your escalation comes down. Now, I know we know that it's the common wisdom, if your significant other says something to you that triggers you, the common wisdom is to what? Take a breath, walk around the block, or you'll be sleeping on the sofa. Right? If you come back at them with a triggered point of view, then it's just going to escalate, right? So you have to de-escalate yourself, maybe help them de-escalate, and then you can have a good healthy communication because your whole brain is switched on at that point. So here is a brain scan of someone triggered versus not triggered. So this is looking above, down at the brain. So when you're triggered, your interior brain, the survival brain trigger response is going, maybe a little bit of the left brain is working. But when you're not triggered, your whole brain turns on. So that way, that's where all your communication skills reside, your empathy, your compassion, your wisdom is available to you. So you want to wait till your brain comes back online. And that's what these excellent communicators learned how to do. So let me give you an example. A woman I coached was having to do budget cuts and thought she might have to lay some people off. She discussed it in private with her top manager and asked him to keep it to himself. They decided to set up a meeting to gather people's ideas on how to cut the budget, and she hoped some people would volunteer to be laid off. After they sent out the meeting request, she got a text from her admin person. All it said was, "How many people are you executing?" Now, my client immediately thought that her top manager had broken his promise and started gossiping and was about to completely ream him out, but she instead chose to talk to me first. She was fuming. And I asked to see the text, and she showed it to me. And I said, "Do you think your admin person actually meant to type that?" "What do you mean?" "Well, what if it's a bad autocorrect?" And she looks at it again. Oh my gosh, maybe it was. Well, it turns out it was. So what do you think the text was supposed to say? Type into the chat if you think you know what her admin was trying to type. She was the one setting up the room. Yeah, so if you typed expecting, you're right. How many people are you expecting? So anything you can do to break out of the survival brain trigger cycle is huge. Like take a breath, walk around the block, talk to an objective third party before you come back at the person. That way you will avoid these unnecessary communication breakdowns. So let's look at habit number 2 that highly resilient and these excellent communicators had, which was they stayed curious as opposed to made assumptions without checking them out. So a typical habit they had was to ask open questions versus having defensive responses. So let's try one out. So say someone says a statement to you that makes you triggered. You're in a meeting, you propose an idea to improve a bad situation at work. Someone important to the discussion says, I don't think so. That idea will not work. So depending on the nature of the relationship, most people would jump into a defensive response, if not out loud, at least in their own head. And I'm suggesting you ask an open question instead. Now, to understand the difference between a defensive response and an open question, a defensive response might be, you're always shooting down these ideas. So responses like that usually make the other person feel, in what way? Well, triggered. When you use words like always and never in responses and speak in an annoyed tone of voice, then you'll likely get the other person triggered. So even though an excellent communicator, a highly resilient person might be feeling triggered in that moment, they would instead short circuit that response and ask an open question to find out what's behind that comment in as neutral a tone of voice as possible. So I usually coach people to say some version of, what's making you say that? Now, why is it so important to ask an open question like that? Well, because you might think they just want to be a jerk. That's why they're saying that. But most people don't say things just to be a jerk. Well, maybe some do, but most don't. They see things in a certain way and figure you ought to see it their way. They had this legit reason for their point of view. So this was an actual situation with a client of mine. She was an HR manager and shared an idea to improve the overall team cohesion in one particular department. And one of the other managers said, that'll never work. So she says, neutral tone, oh, okay, what's making you say that? So he says, well, we tried that last year, don't you remember? And it totally didn't work. So now the HR manager has some context. She has something to work with. She says, oh, I'm not proposing the same way. Let me explain what we learned from last year and how we propose to make it better this time. Well, that calmed the other manager down and he listened and actually liked the idea. So problem solved right there, avoiding an unnecessary communication breakdown. Now, in the past, she would often get triggered by this man's naysaying comments and tone of voice, and it would just create a tense environment, and she would back down and nothing would get solved. Now, you may already do something like that regularly, which is great, but I find there's always sometimes we get caught off guard by someone's tone of voice, and you can also help coach other people on this if they get triggered by other people's naysaying comments. So let's look at another one. An HR manager I worked with said that many of his employees would come up to him and say, I don't like having to work with Bob. So, what would be a fun defensive response to that? Say if you keep hearing that all the time. How about, I don't like having to work with you. Which he did say at one point, and it didn't really move the situation along very well. So he tried this open question with one particular employee just to see what would happen. What's making you say that? And he asked that even though he thought he knew why, but he was surprised by the response. Mostly he heard that people didn't like Bob because he was very critical, but this employee said, well, Bob doesn't show up to work on time and he often doesn't do what he says he's going to do. Oh, okay, that's different. That's something specific now to work with. Now he can try to work with the employee and Bob to help sort it out. If he doesn't particularly know what it's about, he's just getting annoyed at the employee for being a complainer. It's not going to solve it. Now, sometimes that comment, what's making you say that, will work. Sometimes it won't. I realize that. And sometimes it's not your responsibility to fix it. But if you do feel like it's yours to work with and you need more context and you feel triggered, just get that out of your mouth in as neutral a tone of voice as possible And it will usually make a difference. So give it a try in a typical situation where you might get triggered at home or work, and just say, what's making you say that? See what happens. Trying it in your real world will help you see if it will actually work as an ongoing habit. That's what I'm going for here. What are little ongoing habits that can prevent unnecessary communication breakdowns? I use it often, and many of my clients do. It's amazing. Now, sometimes humor can diffuse a tense situation, and this was something that went on at a home improvement store in the paint department. They often get complaints because they can't return a lot of types of paint. So people come back with empty cans and go, I don't like this paint. I want my money back. And so the paint department usually has to say something like, well, sorry, no returns, even though it says that on your receipt. But some people make rude comments, and it was starting to get to some of the employees. So they had a team meeting one day and did something fun. They listed out the most common rude comments they'd heard and did a team brainstorm on humorous comebacks. And no editing, anything goes. But in the end, they chose to try ones that didn't put people down because they didn't want a customer service issue on their hands, but one that diffused the situation. So in one case, the guy says, I want to return this paint. I'm sorry, sir, you can't. There's no returns. Oh, really? Well, I want to speak to the manager. I am the manager, sir. That's our policy on that paint. Well, you can take this paint and shove it up your ass. So the manager said, so interesting. You're the third person to say that to me today, and I'm all full. It totally threw the guy off, made him laugh. Then he said, okay, what other colors do you have? So let's look at habit number 3, which is that they sought collaborative outcomes where possible, versus just trying to get what they wanted. So a quick way to move yourself and others into a collaborative mode, even if there's not a lot of time or skill, is to just state a collaborative intention before you start any discussion that's high stakes. So you might say, I'd like to find a resolution that works for both of us, or in a group situation, I'd like to find an outcome that works for all concerned. That alone will help the others involved calm down the survival brain. We've seen it on the brain scans. Because what happens if you don't state something like this? Well, they'll probably think you're just going to be competitive and want things your way. That's how many of us were culturally conditioned, so this reassures them, and this may help them rise to the occasion too. Here you are saying, I want to be collaborative, and if they're being a jerk, they're going to not really feel so great about their behavior, right? They'll rise to the occasion more likely. So, what's one action you could take in the next 10 days that would really help you just get some good habits going or reinstate habits you've already done before? So I'll give you examples of what I talked about today, but of course, customize it for your own environment. You probably have some great habits as well. But think about it for a specific situation and you're more likely to take action. So for example, what's making you say that? You could do that, say, with your wife, if she says things sometimes that triggers you. Or set up a meeting with John face-to-face on Tuesday and state a collaborative intention to start with. Or de-escalate myself before discussing issues with Tom, if Tom happens to be someone you get triggered with from time to time. So just write one down, put it in the diary, and do it soon, just to see if it will work for you. So if you want more information on all the types of virtual training and keynotes I offer, you can go to carlariegerlive.com. That's Carla with a C, Rieger, R-I-E-G-E-R, live.com. You'll also see free tools there that you can access on the free stuff tab. You can connect me on LinkedIn, or Carla at carlarieger.com is my email. So I'll just end with this great quote. A skilled change leader is like water. The hardest stones are dissolved by the softest water, and water is not trying to do anything. It simply goes on flowing. All the sands in the oceans are nothing but past Himalayas. It really is a unique time in history to begin a renaissance in what's possible. All right, until next time, I'm Carla Rieger. Thank you for listening.